Well, we're going to get all the answers that you've ever wanted to ask about lawyers and was either afraid to ask or didn't know who to ask, because we have the man who, for at least a year, is kind of responsible for all the lawyers in America. He is Justin Stanley, the president of the A.B.A., and he may not like that idea that he's responsible for all lawyers.
I don't think he likes that concept very much, but I guess it goes along with the office.
Okay, I'm going to mention a word and we'll get it out of the way quickly because I'm sure you're tired of talking about it, and I think people are, but Watergate. A lot of people said, gee, that showed you what lawyers really are. And I kind of read it both ways. Yes, there were lawyers involved who were subsequently disbarred, but it also seemed to me that there were lawyers who finally brought it out in the open, who refused to destroy evidence, who could have inside the White House, and no one would have known, couldn't they?
That's correct, they could have. And you're right, the lawyers who were involved, and I regret that there were any lawyers involved,
sure,
but there were. Those who were involved have been, for the most part, as far as I know, all the principal ones have had disciplinary proceedings instituted against them by the states, and many, if not most, have been disbarred. The other side of the coin is that you had people like Archie Cox and Leon Jaworski and Judge Sirica, who stood up tall, yeah, sure, and actually became heroes of it. And the whole process worked. Really, it was a process which proved how functional our system can be, how it can survive blows which conceivably could have destroyed a lesser government.
What kind of a mood do you get? You travel around the country a lot. You see a lot of people. How do you think people feel about lawyers today?
I think that the attitude towards lawyers is changing. We're doing everything that we can, and by we I mean the organized bar, not just the American Bar Association, but state and local bars, to improve the quality of lawyers, to make sure that the bad apples are removed from the bushel. And I think that word of this is getting around so that there would be, I hope, a better attitude on the part of the public. But we have gone through a period where all institutions have been criticized severely by the public. Lawyers have not been alone in that. Doctors in the church, even the media.
The media, certainly the media.
Yeah.
Well, I think we all, I think criticism is healthy, as a matter of fact. I think it keeps us on our toes.
Well, it's healthy if it moves on towards improvement. If it's entirely negative, I think it can be destructive. And that gets back to the responsibility of the citizen to make this democracy work.
Why do you think the lawyers seem to get so much of the brunt of the criticism in our society?
Well, we're out front on so many things. Every piece of litigation, of course, involves lawyers, one at least on each side.
So there's always a loser.
And there's always a loser. But sometimes in the sensational case, the public may find it hard to understand why the defendant in a criminal trial, for example, has counsel at all.
Yeah.
But the answer to that is a very fundamental one. If an accused were not given the right of counsel, you wouldn't have a democracy. You'd have tyranny, probably.
But you know, I find that one of the problems is lawyers can talk about procedural matters and the courts and how they should run, and we can understand it, but I know a lot of times the people say, yeah, but that's gobbledygook. This guy robbed my house and he's walking out of court free because they suppressed his confession or murder or whatever, and those things happen. Okay, we understand why they happen. Let me ask you to try to explain to the guy out there watching who's not a lawyer why they happen and why they should continue to happen.
Well, let me first say that I don't know how often this happens, but it does happen occasionally, where evidence has been illegally seized and therefore may not be introduced in a criminal trial. the purpose of a protection of that sort, and it's a constitutional protection, is really for the benefit of the people. It's very easy for government to exercise the great power that it has and abuse any individual citizen. This happens just as soon as you see a country turn away from a democracy. It happened in India recently,
Yes.
where people were put in jail on no evidence at all, except possibly hearsay or the disposition of the person in power. Now, we've developed a system which says that you can't do that, and you can't convict people on the basis of improper evidence. Now, sometimes the law enforcement agencies get evidence in an improper way. They break into your house. This doesn't happen often, but just to illustrate, they break into your house and seize evidence, which then they seek to introduce into trial. But they have no right to break into your house to get this evidence, and it's for that reason, or similar reasons, that evidence of the kind you mentioned would be excluded. It's not to protect the criminal at all. It's to protect the average guy from having someone abuse him and
do it to him later.
Right.
But it's hard when it's been his house.
Oh,
or,
of course
you know,
it is.
to understand
it all depends on whose ox is being
Yeah.
gored. If it happens, it's to you, it's hard to understand.
How do you see the country going? You know, do you think we have less freedom than we had, say, 50 years ago in this country? You and me, people like you and me.
Well, I don't feel any restriction on the freedom. My greatest worry about this is the pervasive quality of federal government regulation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where that's going. President Carter has spoken of that a number of times in one way or another. The bureaus in Washington, the departments, are so large that we've developed a system under which those people who are put in charge of a department by the president really may have very little influence on the department itself. Decisions are made at lower echelons, and they're made over a period of time, and they build up to a point where the man in charge or woman in charge may not be able to control the decision.
I was staggered to hear just the other day that the energy office, that Schlesinger has 20,000 people in it already. Hasn't even been in existence 3 years.
I didn't know that they already had them, but I knew that that was the number they were shooting for.
That's a lot of people.
Well, you know, if we could just develop solar energy and fusion pretty quickly, we might eliminate a need for all those people.
But now you've had something that's very profound, really. And what's profound about it is that too many people in this country accept big government as a normal way of life. And of course, we've almost made government an entity. It's supposed to be a servant of the people. It's
That's
no longer.
correct.
It's incredible.
Well, you know, that gets back, it seems to me, to the duty of the citizen. You and I have a duty as citizens, quite apart from our jobs, to make sure that our system works. We have a democracy, and it's, as far as I've been able to discover, the best form of government that man's yet devised. It is not efficient, it's slow, it's awkward, it has all sorts of problems, but it can be made to work. But you can't make it work unless the citizens understand it and want to make it work. Adlai Stevenson, former governor of the state of Illinois and the father of our present senator, said democracy is not self-executing. It has to be made to work, and to make it work you have to understand it. And that gets back, Joe, it seems to me, in part at least, to our educational system. For many decades, it seems to me that we made very little attempt in our public schools to teach the kids, the school children, about democracy and about how it should function. We had expository courses in civics where Memorization was called for, and then if you regurgitated what you'd memorized in the examination, you passed. But we got into, the American Bar Association got into this subject in the 60s in Chicago, along with the Board of Education and some federal judges. About the same time, another group was starting in California, and working with teachers and judges and interested people generally, we developed some courses that could be introduced into schools. Well, the A.B.A. did, this was a local thing. Then the A.B.A., once this had started, formed a committee which we call the Youth Education for Citizenship Committee, not to develop courses of its own, but to act as a catalyst and help groups set up courses around the country.
Right.
There are now over 500 projects like this, and it's catching. Right. May I tell you, give you just one illustration of the kind of thing they do? It brings the children into the decision-making. I'll capsule this, but there was a place called Sunshine Valley, and the Indians lived there, and it was beautiful. The skies were clear, and the rains came at night. There were fish and game, and so on. The white settlers came. And they offered to buy land from the Indians. The Indians didn't know much about that, but they did sell them some land. And then in due course, the white settlers put fences around their property. There was no place for the Indians to go, so they left. And then the men from Mars came down, and they bought some land from the white settlers, and they bought it in a checkerboard fashion. They paid a very high price for it, and the white settlers thought they were crazy, but Martians left. Then they came back again, and they bought from the owners whose land they had not bought the right to the sky over the land. This seemed silly. They left, they came back again, and then they started building mushroom houses on the land that they owned. It would completely block out the sky. At this point, the white settlers sued the Martians. Now, this would be a project that would go to 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and you ask the students who wants to be on the jury, who will serve as a judge, who will represent the white settler, who will represent the Martians, and who will represent the Indians.
Great.
Now, this is an exciting sort of thing, and the reaction of the school children to this sort of a program is just wonderful. We put out a film called To Reason Why, and I commend it to anyone. It discusses this whole problem. It shows how the children react to it, and it's a very exciting thing. Of course, as you go on, as you move from kindergarten up through the 12th grade, you reach a point where groups of students are going down to the state legislatures. They're talking to their legislators. They're trying to get measures introduced. They're wondering why action isn't taken on bills. And you develop a student body that knows how democracy is supposed to function, and they're interested in it. Now, if we can have a citizenry of that sort, I think we're going to be good.
But you know, something that always has bothered me, and I don't have a good answer for it yet, is that if what lawyers do is so important, and surely it is, it's the oil of human relationships, they keep flowing, how can you charge money for it? You know,
well, I suppose it's hard to live without income.
But it's like a preacher. It's like a preacher saying, yeah, you can come and hear me speak, and it costs you $2.50 an hour.
Well, it's not quite like that, because the preacher gets paid, as I'm saying. But
you know my point I'm making.
Sure I do, and you have raised an interesting point, because when lawyers, they weren't known as lawyers then, first started out, they were not paid. They gave advice. They were learned people, and the public came to them for advice. And this developed into a kind of what we would now call elitism, where only the very wealthy could afford to sit back and be profound.
Right.
And with a very small group, you could question the profundity and the wisdom of some of them. And then gradually they were permitted to charge fees for their work, and now of course they do. And without it, I don't know how many who are now lawyers wouldn't be, but I know I would be one. I make a living practicing law, and if I weren't paid for what I do, I couldn't practice law.
Well, it's like a lot of doctors tell me that they have never been able to get over charging for what they do because they know what they do is more important than just to earn a living.
If
now, I know a lot don't feel that way.
Well, let's put it another way. One of the most unpleasant parts of law practice to me is submitting a bill.
Yeah.
But it has to be done.
Right. How do you feel about public interest law, pro bono firms doing legal work free for people who can't afford proper legal services?
Well, you touched on two concepts there. There is now a National Legal Services Corporation which is designed to render legal services to the poor without charge. The American Bar Association, I'm pleased to say, was one of the proponents of that. They've supported it. I've testified in Congress on its behalf with respect to its budget, and it's doing well. It does require, even so, a substantial amount of contributed time by practicing lawyers who aren't working for the corporation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the pro bono activity which I thought you were referring to was a kind of activity where a group will intervene in a hearing before an administrative tribunal or a court on behalf of some group that they think is not represented. Those are called public interest firms, and we encourage that. That is to say, the A.B.A. does encourage that as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of time is given by lawyers to improve the system of justice, uncompensated time. Of course, that's what I'm doing about 100% this year. It's been said, and one of your most famous Chicago lawyer, or Florida lawyers, has said that every lawyer should give 10% of his or her time doing work for the poor. I think that's an oversimplification of it. I think that the poor do need help. I think that steps are being taken to provide that. And I think that lawyers should give their time, but I don't know that it should be simply for that. I think it should be broader.
Yeah. How do you feel about the judiciary in this country? And when I ask you that question, I think, what's he going to say? He's going to say it's, well, what are you going to say?
Well,
I would predict you wouldn't have much criticism.
There are a lot of things to be said about it. My impression, and it's based on quite a bit of experience, is that the quality of the federal judiciary is improving, continuing to improve, and I think by and large we have a fine federal bench. In many, well, the record of the states is uneven. Mm-hmm. We have strongly advocated merit selection of judges and the appointive process.
Remove them from elections.
Right. In Chicago recently we had an election where under our system judges run on their record without party designation, which would appear to be a perfectly good way to do it. But in the Chicago area, I think there were over 50 judges running on their record, and there was just no way that even an active lawyer could pass on all of those. There'd be no way that the average individual could possibly exercise good judgment. So there are two comments on that, excuse me. I think that system ought to be changed so that after a judge's term is expired, I'm now talking about state systems, the judge would have to appear before a committee, which would then recommend retention or not.
Committee of?
Lawyers, laymen.
Okay, a mixture of...
Surely. Right. But there's another thing that should be said about this. In Illinois, for example, I know more about that than I know about other states. We proposed a merit selection system. It passed in Chicago and the Cook County areas, but it was defeated by the downstate vote because people in smaller communities say, we know our lawyers. We like to look a man straight in the eye and vote him up or down. Well, I dare say that they may be able to do that, but what we have been doing since the beginning of our democracy has been to determine things like this on a state basis.
Mm-hmm.
I think we ought to take another look at that. I don't know that the same rules should apply in Chicago that apply in downstate Illinois. Maybe we ought to have a merit system in Chicago and an elective system in downstate.
I think I think it is hard to try and blanket this country.
It
God
is.
knows it's so huge, and
right, and
which is
communities
what they've tried to do with obscenity, for example. The community standards concept.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to be upheld. The Hustler case in Cincinnati, I think, is going to be a retest of that. Very quickly, let's talk about some other things.
All right.
Do you think there are too many things in courts today?
Yes.
Why is that happening?
I wish I knew the answer to that. We tend to take everything to court. As I've said on occasion, it's so bad that if a speaker tells an Irish joke, he may find himself hauled into court by the Irish Fellowship. Jack Mabley, a columnist in one of the Chicago papers, told a story about two boys arguing in the schoolyard, and they were about to come to blows, and one said to the other, if you hit me, my old man will sue your old man for every cent he has. I might have stopped the fight, but that is what happens. You may recall the incident in Washington, D.C. a year or so ago when the Redskins were playing the Cardinals, and there was a disputed touchdown pass. Yes. So somebody filed a lawsuit about it. I think we have to learn to get along with each other. Cases of the kind I've been referring to, or disputes, aren't going to make any money for anyone. There's no incentive,
well, I was going to ask you,
incentive to do it.
I was going to ask you if one of the reasons is that we have so many lawyers.
No, I don't.
And there's not enough business.
I don't think that's it. I think it's far deeper than that. I think it's an attitude of the public. You know, I talked earlier about responsibility.
Yeah.
And maybe this is another reflection of it. Maybe it's a lack of self-discipline. Maybe that's back of a lot of our troubles.
Which, of course, now we get back to the people. You know, the people seem to want to expect more from smaller segments than they expect of themselves.
Right.
And, you know, the self-sacrifice has kind of gone out of fashion in this country.
Yeah.
The energy crisis is proving that. It's going to take a terrible jolt, and I'm afraid it's coming, to force people to conserve, to you know, withhold, to not buy everything they want, and so forth. But I don't know how you make that happen.
Maybe we do it only by crises. That's been the history. When we had what we thought was, and I thought in fact was, a gasoline oil crisis a couple years ago, we did tighten our belts a little bit, and it was very helpful. But then we called that off, I think mistakenly, because the energy crisis is with us.
Oh, yeah.
And it's going to get worse.
It is indeed. Do you think there can be too many lawyers in our society?
Oh, of course there can be.
Well, are we getting close to it now?
Well, I doubt it. We have more lawyers per capita than any other country in the world. Mm-hmm. But we have a democracy here, and we do not want to foreclose the opportunity to become lawyers to any groups. Right. I think that would be a mistake. No one that I know of has enough wisdom to say how many lawyers there should be, and there should be that many and no more. I think we have to provide the opportunity for those who want to become lawyers and who are qualified academically to do so. Mm-hmm. So go ahead. Now, not all of them will become or even remain practicing lawyers. The legal education, however, they may find to be useful in other respects. Yeah. I think that supply and demand will bear on that. You may recall a few years ago when everybody wanted to be an engineer.
Yes.
And everybody became an engineer, and all of a sudden there were too many.
Right.
and then the engineers started going to law schools.
Right.
I think it levels out, but it seems to me that rather than to provide more controls or dictatorship, we ought to let democracy function on it.
I think you're right. Well, our time is up. You really have given up your practice for a year in Chicago to be the president of, or do you still do some practice?
I guess my time this year will be about 10% practice perhaps and 90 on the other.
Yeah. Did you survive the winter up there all right?
Oh, it was fine.
It was fine? I heard otherwise. I used to work at the corner of Michigan and Wacker, and I used to, in the winters, take the rope to go across the bridge.
Pretty windy. We're known as the Windy City.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much,
You're
Justice
very
Stanley.
welcome. I've enjoyed it.
Good having you. We'll be right back.